The house stood in a quiet suburban neighborhood, its gray shingled roof gleaming under the soft morning light. The neatly trimmed lawn stretched out in front, edged by flower beds bursting with color. A white picket fence framed the yard, reinforcing the image of an ideal family home. Inside, everything was in order. The kitchen counters gleamed, the air carried the faint scent of fresh coffee, and framed family portraits lined the hallway walls. Smiling faces, picture-perfect moments, a husband, a wife, and their children. To the outside world, the McNeil family embodied success. Martin McNeil, a respected doctor, was admired not only for his medical expertise, but also for his charm and intelligence. His wife, Michelle, a former beauty queen, was graceful and devoted, managing their bustling household while radiating warmth and elegance. Together, they had 8 children, 4 biological and 4 adopted, filling their home with laughter and life. But perfection is often an illusion. Beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. Small, almost imperceptible at first. Michelle had grown quieter in recent months, her once radiant smile dimming ever so slightly. Friends noticed subtle changes, moments of hesitation in her voice, a shadow in her eyes. Even her eldest daughter, Alexis, felt it, a tension lingering beneath the polished exterior of their family life. Then came the unexpected decision. Martin had insisted Michelle undergo cosmetic surgery. He claimed it was for her, that she deserved to feel young and beautiful. But Michelle had been reluctant. She was aging gracefully and saw no need for such procedures. Yet Martin persisted, reassuring her, urging her, until she finally agreed. As the surgery date approached, Michelle voiced her unease to Alexis. "I don't know why, but something doesn't feel right," she admitted one evening, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her teacup. Alexis brushed off her concerns at first. Perhaps it was just pre-surgery nerves. But then Michelle said something that sent a chill down her spine. "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." Alexis frowned, unsettled. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Michelle hesitated before shaking her head. "Never mind, just stay close, okay?" Alexis nodded, but deep down, an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. At the time, she had no idea just how right her mother was. The days leading up to Michelle's surgery passed in a blur of routine and preparation. The house remained as lively as ever, children rushing in and out, laughter echoing through the hallways, and Martin moving with his usual air of authority. If anyone had noticed anything unusual, they had dismissed it as the normal tension that came with a major medical procedure. Michelle, however, could not shake the gnawing unease in her gut. She had always trusted her instincts. As a mother of 8, she had learned to sense when something was amiss, whether it was a child's silent distress or the subtle shift in the atmosphere of her home. But this feeling, this lingering dread, was different. It settled over her like a weight she could not lift. In the quiet moments when she was alone in their bedroom, she would catch herself staring into the mirror, searching for answers in her own reflection. Was it just anxiety, the fear of surgery, or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? One night, she found herself standing by the window, looking out into the darkness. The street was quiet, the familiar outline of their neighborhood cast in the glow of porch lights. Michelle wrapped her arms around herself, trying to push away the creeping paranoia. Martin had been more attentive than usual, watching her closely, as if measuring something she could not understand. When she mentioned her apprehensions to him, he had smiled in that calm, practiced way of his. "You're overthinking things," he had assured her. "It's a simple procedure. You'll feel amazing afterward." But the reassurance felt hollow. As the night of the surgery drew closer, Michelle reached out to Alexis once more. Unlike the others, Alexis always listened, always saw the small details that others missed. Michelle chose her words carefully, not wanting to sound irrational. "I need you to keep an eye on things," she said quietly. "No matter what happens, I need you to be strong." Alexis hesitated, sensing the urgency in her mother's voice. "Mom, you're scaring me." Michelle managed a small smile, but it did not reach her eyes. "I just need you to trust me, okay?" Alexis nodded, but the unease remained. The day of the surgery arrived. Michelle kissed her children goodbye, smiling despite the apprehension swirling inside her. As she walked out the door, she paused for a brief moment, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. It was as if some part of her was reluctant to leave. Then she stepped forward, unaware that she was walking toward a fate she had already foreseen. The hours that passed after Michelle entered the operating room felt like an eternity to her family. Martin had dropped her off with a kiss on the cheek, his smile reassuring, yet somehow too practiced to feel genuine. He sat in the waiting room, flipping through a medical journal, occasionally glancing at his watch, as if time itself had become a distant concern. Michelle's surgery was supposed to be straightforward, nothing out of the ordinary, the kind of procedure many women underwent to feel rejuvenated, to defy time's inevitable march. But as the minutes stretched into hours, Martin's casual demeanor began to unravel. He couldn't focus on the magazine in his hands, his eyes darting constantly to the door, his fingers drumming against his leg. He wanted this to be over. In the operating room, Michelle lay unconscious on the table, unaware of the danger quietly creeping closer to her. The surgeon and nurses moved with practiced precision, performing the routine procedure that would transform Michelle's appearance. But what no one knew was that there was more at play than the scalpel and stitches. An hour passed, then two, and when the surgeon finally came to speak to Martin, it was not the relief he had expected. There was an unusual complication. Michelle had experienced an unexpected reaction to the anesthesia. Her vitals were dipping dangerously low. The procedure had gone as planned, but now it was no longer just about the surgery. It was about keeping Michelle alive. The minutes felt like hours as Martin processed the information, but his calm remained outwardly unshaken. He nodded in understanding, but the truth was, his mind was elsewhere. By the time Michelle was wheeled into recovery, her condition had stabilized, but her world, as well as Martin's, had shifted. Michelle was groggy and disoriented, her body reacting to the cocktail of drugs and sedatives she had been given. She barely registered the sterile surroundings of the recovery room, the distant hum of machines, and the soft beeping of monitors that tracked her pulse. She felt a dull ache where the surgery had been, but it was the unease that lingered most. As her eyes fluttered open, Martin was there, as expected, but there was something about the way he looked at her, something colder than the man who had dropped her off that morning. It was as if he was watching her, waiting for something, and Michelle couldn't quite place it. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness swept over her. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. "You're going to be okay," Martin said softly, his voice so reassuring it almost felt like a whisper in the back of her mind. But Michelle wasn't so sure. She wasn't sure of much anymore. The next few hours blurred together. Michelle was monitored closely, but the fatigue from the surgery and the drugs kept her in and out of consciousness. She had only the vaguest memory of Martin sitting at her side, occasionally checking his watch or making a quiet call, but she didn't have the energy to question him. What she did notice, though, was the small things. The way he seemed anxious, the way his eyes would flicker nervously when the nurse came in, the way he avoided her gaze whenever she tried to speak. There was no anger, no clear indication of malice, but Michelle felt a chill, as if the room itself had grown colder every time she opened her eyes. By the time she was discharged and brought back home, she was barely able to keep her eyes open. The soft hum of the car's engine was like a lullaby, and she drifted in and out of sleep, unsure if the world outside her closed eyelids even existed. At home, everything seemed normal. The house was filled with the comforting smells of dinner, the sounds of children playing in the background. But it didn't feel the same. The tension, the disquiet, had crept in unnoticed, but now it was impossible to ignore. Michelle found herself sinking into a quiet dread that settled deep within her. She tried to ignore it. She told herself it was just the after effects of the surgery, the pain, the weakness, the strange fog clouding her thoughts. But deep down, she knew better. She had never been a stranger to discomfort, and this was different. Later that evening, Martin returned to his usual routine. The kids were sent to bed, and the house became eerily silent, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of papers as Martin went through his medical journals in the study. But Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something she couldn't put her finger on. She tried to rest in their bed, the covers pulled tightly around her, but it felt like she was waiting for something to happen. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, and inside the house was still. Too still. Then came the faintest noise, a sound she had almost missed, but it caught her attention. Martin was speaking quietly to someone on the phone. It wasn't a tone of urgency, but it was the subject of the conversation that made Michelle's heart race. "Yes, I'll handle it. It won't be a problem. I'll make sure everything's taken care of." She tried to focus, but her mind was foggy, clouded by the medication still coursing through her veins. She couldn't make sense of it, but the whisper of the conversation lingered, gnawing at her. By the time the night grew late and she drifted into a restless sleep, Michelle had no way of knowing that the most dangerous part of her journey had only just begun. The following days passed in a strange haze. Michelle moved through the house as if drifting between two realities. One where she was recovering from surgery, comforted by the familiar surroundings of her home, and another where an unshakable sense of fear followed her like a shadow. She tried to dismiss it as the lingering effects of the pain medication, but deep down, she knew better. Something was wrong. Her body felt heavier than it should have, her mind clouded by exhaustion that didn't seem natural. Sitting at the kitchen table one morning, she struggled to keep her eyes open. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, the comforting sounds of her children's voices in the background. It should have felt normal, but normal was slipping further and further from her grasp. Martin moved around the kitchen with ease, pouring himself a cup of coffee, scanning the newspaper as if nothing had changed. He looked at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "You should rest," he said simply, before turning his attention back to the paper. Michelle wanted to respond, to tell him she had been resting, but the words stuck in her throat. A slow realization crept into her mind. She had been spending most of her time asleep, yet she was still overwhelmingly tired. She had never felt this way before, not even after her previous surgeries. It was a fatigue that seemed unnatural, like a weight pressing down on her. She reached for the glass of water in front of her hand trembling slightly. She had always been strong, independent, capable of pushing through discomfort, but now even lifting the glass felt like an effort. Something wasn't right. Later that afternoon, as she sat curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the television, her thoughts kept returning to the conversation she had overheard the night before. Martin had been speaking in hushed tones, his voice too low to fully make out his words, but she remembered the certainty in his tone. "I'll take care of it." A chill ran down her spine. She wanted to believe it had nothing to do with her, but the timing was too unsettling. The surgery, the unexplained exhaustion, the way Martin had been watching her, calculating, patient. Her mind swirled with doubt. Was she imagining things, letting her fears get the best of her? By evening, the exhaustion had worsened. Michelle had always been a light sleeper, but now it felt as if her body was betraying her. No matter how much she tried to stay alert, her eyelids grew heavy, her thoughts slipping in and out of consciousness. She barely registered Martin helping her to bed, his hands careful but firm. She could hear his voice in the distance, soft and measured, though the words blurred together. And then, darkness. The next morning, when she opened her eyes, she felt worse. Her head pounded, her limbs ached, and a strange dizziness made it difficult to sit up. The realization hit her like a cold wave. This wasn't just exhaustion, it was something more. Something inside her whispered a warning, an instinct honed over years of being a mother, of sensing danger before it fully revealed itself. She had to fight through the haze, had to stay awake long enough to figure out what was happening. For the first time in her life, Michelle felt truly afraid, and she had no idea how much time she had left. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the bedroom floor. But for Michelle, there was no warmth in it. She lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, her body heavy, her mind sluggish. Every breath felt like an effort, as though she were sinking into something deep and inescapable. She couldn't remember falling asleep the night before. There were only fragments, Martin's voice, the feeling of being guided into bed, the overwhelming weight of exhaustion pulling her under. Now as she tried to move, a deep unease settled over her. Something was wrong with her body. For years, Michelle had prided herself on her strength, on her ability to manage a house full of children, a marriage that often felt more like a duty than a partnership, and the responsibilities that came with maintaining the perfect image of their family. She had been tired before, but this was different. She closed her eyes and tried to push through the fog in her mind. Had she taken too much medication? Had Martin given her something more? The thought was absurd, wasn't it? He was a doctor, her husband. He wouldn't. A quiet knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. A small voice followed. Mom. It was one of her younger daughters. Michelle wanted to respond, to sit up, to reassure her child that everything was fine. But her body resisted. The simple act of lifting her head sent a sharp, nauseating wave of dizziness through her. She managed a weak sound, barely a whisper, and a moment later, the door creaked open. Her daughter stepped inside hesitantly, peering at her with worried eyes. Are you okay? Michelle forced a smile, though even that felt like a monumental effort. Just a little tired, sweetheart. Her own voice sounded foreign to her, weak, distant. The little girl nodded but lingered in the doorway, as if sensing that something was not quite right. A shadow moved behind her. Martin appeared, his presence filling the room with an unsettling quiet. He placed a hand on their daughter's shoulder, offering a reassuring squeeze before gently ushering her away. Let your mother rest, he said smoothly. The door closed, leaving them alone. Michelle swallowed hard, fighting the thick fog in her mind. She wanted to sit up, to push away the feeling of helplessness that had taken hold of her, but her limbs felt like they were filled with lead. Martin stood at the foot of the bed watching her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. You need to sleep, he finally said, his voice calm, almost soothing. Michelle wanted to ask him why she felt this way, why she couldn't seem to stay awake, why the air between them felt heavier than ever before. But her body betrayed her. Her eyelids drooped. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Martin, standing in the same spot, watching, waiting. That night, the house was eerily quiet. The children were asleep, the world outside their suburban home wrapped in the stillness of the late hours. But inside, something unseen lingered in the air, an unspoken tension, a slow-moving inevitability. Michelle stirred once, shifting in bed, her body weak, her breath shallow. She didn't know that this was the last time she would ever open her eyes. She didn't know that by morning, everything would change. She didn't know that the whispers of doubt, the unshakable fear, had all been leading to this. Because when the sun rose, Michelle McNeil would be gone. The morning arrived like any other, sunlight spilling through the windows, the air crisp with the quiet stillness of dawn. Outside, the neighborhood began to stir, cars pulling out of driveways, joggers making their way down the sidewalks, the distant hum of life unfolding in its usual rhythm. But inside the McNeil home, time had frozen. It was Martin who made the call. His voice was eerily steady, carrying just enough urgency to convey distress without unraveling into hysteria. My wife, she's in the bathtub. I think she's dead. The dispatcher on the other end remained calm, guiding him through basic steps. But Martin was adamant there was nothing more to be done. She's gone. Minutes later, sirens pierced the quiet suburban morning, a stark contrast to the carefully curated perfection of the McNeil household. Paramedics arrived first, moving swiftly up the driveway, their boots crunching against the pavement as they entered the house. The children had been ushered away, kept at a distance from the unfolding scene. The bathroom was large and pristine, its marble counters gleaming under the soft overhead lights. The tub sat in the center of the room, deep and spacious, framed by elegant fixtures. And there, beneath the water's still surface, was Michelle. She was motionless, her body unnaturally limp, her skin pale and eerily smooth. The water was clear, undisturbed, lacking the frantic splashes or signs of struggle that typically accompanied accidental drownings. Her face was serene, almost peaceful, as if she had simply drifted into sleep and never awoken. A paramedic knelt beside the tub, pressing 2 fingers to her neck, though the outcome was already obvious. Cold, stiff. She had been dead for hours. Martin stood nearby, his expression a mixture of shock and devastation, though his eyes, dark and unwavering, betrayed no real panic. He recounted the events of the morning in a detached, measured tone. I found her like this. She was fine last night, but I don't know. She must have slipped and drowned. The statement hung in the air, a simple explanation wrapped in uncertainty. One of the paramedics studied the scene, something about it gnawing at the edges of his instincts. There were details that didn't quite fit. Michelle's hair was barely wet, only the ends submerged in water. If she had drowned, why weren't there signs of struggle? Why weren't her arms raised, grasping for something? Anything. Still, for now, there were no immediate answers. The body was removed with care, a white sheet draped over Michelle's delicate frame as she was taken from the home she had once filled with life. In the hours that followed, the house remained unnervingly quiet. The children, confused and heartbroken, clung to one another, their worlds suddenly fractured in a way that felt irreparable. Friends and neighbors began to arrive, offering condolences, whispering in hushed tones as they glanced toward the house that had once seemed so perfect. But beneath the surface, unease lingered. Martin grieved in a way that was almost performative, his sadness measured and controlled. There were no wild outbursts of emotion, no raw devastation that one might expect from a man who had just lost his wife so suddenly. Instead, he moved with precision, making calls, arranging plans, ensuring that everything was handled. He wasted no time in requesting that Michelle's body be quickly prepared for burial. He wanted a simple service, nothing too drawn out, no prolonged autopsy, no unnecessary investigation. There's no need, he insisted when asked if further examination should be done. It was an accident. My wife had health issues. She wouldn't have suffered. It was said with such certainty, such finality, that for a moment those around him accepted it. But not everyone. Not Michelle's eldest daughter, Alexis. Not the investigators who would later review the case. And certainly not the truth, which was waiting, patiently, silently, to be uncovered. Michelle McNeil was laid to rest under a sky heavy with gray clouds. The funeral was swift, almost too swift, with Martin orchestrating every detail like a man eager to close a chapter rather than mourn a profound loss. He moved through the ceremony with the same measured composure he had displayed since her death, shaking hands, nodding solemnly at condolences, accepting the hushed murmurs of sympathy with an air of practiced grief. But beneath the carefully curated display, unease festered. Alexis McNeil stood apart from the crowd, her arms crossed tightly against the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Her mother was gone. Just days ago they had spoken, and now Michelle was nothing more than a framed photograph at the front of the church. Alexis's grief was raw, but woven through it was something else. A quiet, unshakable sense that something wasn't right. Her mother had been fine before the surgery. Nervous, yes, but strong, healthy. She had never mentioned any heart problems, yet Martin had insisted that was the cause of death. It didn't add up. And the speed at which her father had moved to bury Michelle, to move on, sent a sharp warning through Alexis's mind. She watched as Martin stood near the casket, his hand resting lightly against the polished wood, his expression appropriately somber. But she knew her father. She had seen him angry, frustrated, impatient. She had seen his charm and his deception. And what she saw now wasn't sorrow, it was control. As the final prayers were spoken and guests began to disperse, Alexis found herself locked in thought. She needed answers. She needed to understand what had really happened in that house, on that morning, in the hours when her mother had slipped from life so suddenly. She wasn't alone in her suspicions. Some of Michelle's closest friends had been whispering among themselves, their condolences laced with confusion. Michelle had told them about the surgery, about her reluctance. She had expressed her fears, her concerns about Martin, and now, just like that, she was gone. It was too neat, too convenient. The whispers grew louder. Neighbors recalled seeing Martin in the days after Michelle's death, noting how composed he seemed, how quickly he had begun making arrangements, how calculated his grief appeared. Some dismissed it as a man coping in his own way. Others weren't so sure. The murmurs eventually reached the ears of authorities. At first, the case had seemed open and shut. A woman with recent medical procedures, a history of fatigue, found unresponsive in her home. But now doubts were creeping in. There were no obvious signs of foul play, no wounds, no violent struggle. Yet something about the circumstances gnawed at those tasked with reviewing the case. The medical examiner's report would be the key. When the first examination was conducted, the cause of death had been ruled natural causes, attributed to heart disease. It was a convenient answer, one that aligned with Martin's claims. But Alexis refused to accept it. Her mother had never been diagnosed with heart disease. Determined to uncover the truth, she pushed for a second opinion, reaching out to medical professionals, questioning the official narrative. She combed through every detail she could access: Michelle's medical records, her prescriptions, the timeline of events. And the deeper she dug, the more uneasy she became. Her mother had been prescribed a cocktail of powerful medications following the surgery: sedatives, painkillers, muscle relaxants, enough to keep anyone in a near comatose state. Had Michelle really drowned on her own? Or had she been too weak, too disoriented to fight back against something or someone else? The thought sent a cold shiver through Alexis's spine. Her mother had warned her, and now it was up to her to prove that Michelle had been right. The weeks following Michelle McNeil's death passed in a blur of mourning, unanswered questions, and a growing sense of unease that refused to be ignored. For Alexis, grief was a weight she carried heavily, but beneath it was something stronger: a drive, a quiet but unwavering determination to uncover the truth. She could still hear her mother's voice in her head, that whispered warning before the surgery. "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." Those words had been haunting her since the moment she received the news. At first, she had wanted to dismiss them, to believe that maybe it had just been her mother's nerves, a fleeting moment of paranoia before a routine procedure. But now she knew better. The pieces didn't fit. Her mother had always been meticulous with her health. Despite Martin's claims that Michelle had underlying heart issues, Alexis had never seen any signs of it. Her mother had never spoken of heart problems, never taken medication for them, never mentioned anything that suggested she was at risk. Yet now heart disease had conveniently been listed as the cause of death. It didn't make sense. And then there was Martin. His behavior in the days after Michelle's passing had been unnatural, too controlled, too rehearsed. Alexis had watched him closely, noting the way he handled things with an efficiency that felt cold, detached, almost as if he had been expecting this to happen. There was no real shock, no devastation, only a well-calculated plan to move forward. She had barely been able to process her mother's death before another unsettling development took place. A woman moved into their house. Her name was Gypsy Willis, and Martin had introduced her as the new nanny for the younger children. But Alexis knew better. Gypsy was not just a nanny. She was the woman Martin had been involved with, the woman he had been seeing behind Michelle's back. And now, not even a month after her mother's death, she was here, in their home, standing in the place where Michelle should have been. The realization hit Alexis like a gut punch. It was too soon. No grieving husband would do this, not unless he had already planned for it. The rest of the family noticed it too. Michelle's younger children, still too young to fully grasp what had happened, were confused. Their mother was gone, and now there was a stranger in their home, slipping into their lives as if she had always belonged. The whispers in the community grew louder. Neighbors who had once admired the McNeil family now spoke in hushed tones, exchanging glances whenever Martin was near. People were beginning to talk. Alexis refused to let it go. She started digging. She requested a deeper review of her mother's autopsy, pushing for a second opinion. She went through medical records, searching for anything that could confirm or contradict the official narrative. The more she looked, the more unsettling the truth became. Michelle had been prescribed a dangerous combination of medications following her surgery: oxycodone, Valium, Ambien, Phenergan, and Lortab. Any one of those could have sedated her, made her drowsy, left her unable to react quickly. Together, they were a recipe for something far worse. Had she been too weak to stay conscious in the bathtub? Had her body simply shut down under the weight of the drugs? Or had someone made sure she wouldn't wake up? The questions gnawed at her, and then she discovered something that sent an even colder chill through her veins. Martin had pushed for a quick burial. He had fought against a full autopsy. He had wanted everything handled as soon as possible, with minimal investigation. Why? What was he afraid they would find? The truth was there, waiting to be uncovered. Alexis just had to prove it. She wasn't ready to stop, and she wasn't going to let this go until justice was served. The more Alexis dug, the more the illusion of her family's perfection crumbled. Michelle's death had been too convenient, too perfectly timed, and now the pieces were beginning to fall into place. Martin had moved swiftly, ensuring that questions were silenced before they could even be asked. But Alexis refused to be one of those voices drowned out by grief and manipulation. She found herself poring over medical reports late into the night, highlighting details, cross-referencing timelines. The more she analyzed her mother's prescriptions, the more uneasy she became. The sheer volume of medication Michelle had been prescribed after surgery was staggering. Painkillers, sedatives, anti-nausea drugs, muscle relaxants, enough to incapacitate even a healthy person. The official cause of death may have been listed as heart disease, but there was something more sinister hidden beneath the surface. Then came the most damning realization. Martin had personally handled Michelle's medications after the surgery. He had insisted on being the one to administer them, making sure she took each dose himself. At the time, it had seemed like an act of care, a husband ensuring his wife's recovery. But now, in hindsight, it looked like something far more calculated. Had Michelle truly drowned, or had she been too drugged to fight back against something, or someone? The idea made Alexis's stomach twist. She needed someone to listen. She turned to the authorities, presenting them with every inconsistency, every concern, every alarming fact she had uncovered. She wasn't alone. Michelle's friends had their own suspicions, recalling conversations where Michelle had expressed fear, where she had voiced concerns about Martin's behavior. Neighbors whispered about how quickly Gypsy had appeared in the McNeil home, how effortlessly she had taken Michelle's place. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof. Alexis pushed harder, demanding a deeper investigation, refusing to let her mother's case be swept aside as an unfortunate accident. She reached out to medical examiners, forensic experts, anyone who could confirm what she already knew in her heart. And then, the first crack in Martin's carefully crafted facade appeared. A re-examination of Michelle's toxicology report revealed a dangerous combination of drugs still lingering in her system at the time of death. Each medication on its own had side effects: drowsiness, slowed breathing, confusion. But together, they could render someone completely incapacitated. It was the confirmation Alexis needed. Michelle had been drugged. She had been left vulnerable. And the person who had controlled every pill she swallowed was Martin McNeil. The reality of it was almost too much to comprehend. This wasn't just an unfaithful husband. This wasn't just a man who had grown tired of his marriage and sought comfort in the arms of another woman. This was something deeper, darker. A man willing to manipulate, deceive, and if the evidence continued to build, kill. Alexis knew she had to keep going. She wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. She was fighting for justice. And Martin McNeil was running out of places to hide. The walls around Martin McNeil were beginning to close in. For years, he had crafted an image of perfection. A brilliant doctor, a devoted husband, a man of stature and respect. But now the cracks were visible, and the truth that had lurked beneath the surface was finally clawing its way out. Alexis refused to back down. Armed with the toxicology report and her mother's chilling last words, she turned to anyone who would listen. Law enforcement, forensic specialists, even the media. Michelle's death had been dismissed too quickly, brushed off as a tragic accident. But accidents didn't leave behind trails of deception. They didn't involve hidden affairs, suspicious overdoses, and a husband who seemed more interested in moving forward than mourning. Investigators, now taking a closer look at the case, found themselves drawn into the tangled web of Martin's past. What had once seemed like the tragic death of a middle-aged woman recovering from surgery was morphing into something far more insidious. There were too many coincidences, too many convenient details. And then there was Gypsy Willis, the woman who had seamlessly stepped into Michelle's place within days of her death. Neighbors whispered about her presence in the house, the way she acted as though she had always belonged there. She wasn't a grieving widow offering support to a struggling family. She was a replacement, a woman who had been waiting in the wings just beyond sight until the moment was right. And then came the discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Martin had forged documents in the weeks following Michelle's death, attempting to shift assets, alter financial records, and even create a new identity for Gypsy using one of his adopted daughter's names. It wasn't just suspicious, it was criminal. With this new evidence in hand, authorities finally had enough to act. They weren't ready to charge him with murder. Not yet, but they had him on fraud. And once they had him in custody, they could dig deeper. The moment of reckoning arrived in a way Martin never expected. Law enforcement arrived at his home, their presence a stark contrast to the carefully maintained illusion of normalcy he had built. His arrogance had made him careless, and now it was catching up with him. As officers led him away in handcuffs, Alexis watched from a distance. This wasn't the end, nowhere close, but it was a step, a crack in the armor of a man who had spent his entire life manipulating those around him. And for the first time since her mother's death, she felt something close to hope, because Martin McNeil was no longer untouchable. Justice was coming. Martin McNeil had spent his life bending reality to fit his own desires, manipulating those around him with practiced ease. He was a man accustomed to control, to shaping the narrative in a way that kept him untouchable. But now, sitting in a cold interrogation room, stripped of his tailored suits and the aura of prestige he had carefully cultivated, the cracks were fully exposed. Authorities weren't questioning him about Michelle's death. Not yet. They knew better than to give him the advantage of preparation. Instead, they focused on what they could prove: fraud, identity theft, financial crimes. He had used deception to manipulate the system, just as he had manipulated people, and now the system was fighting back. Meanwhile, Alexis was relentless. She wasn't content with watching her father face charges for fraud. That wasn't enough. Michelle's death had been too perfectly orchestrated, too methodical to be anything but premeditated. And Alexis knew that if she didn't push harder, if she didn't force the truth into the light, her mother's death would remain an unanswered question, just another closed case buried under layers of convenience and complacency. Investigators were starting to listen. They re-examined Michelle's medical records, comparing her prescriptions to the toxicology report. The combination of oxycodone, Valium, Ambien, Phenergan, and Lortab had been enough to leave her disoriented, physically weakened, barely capable of staying awake. Had she slipped and drowned in the bathtub, as Martin had claimed? Or had she been too sedated to even fight for her life? It wasn't just the drugs that raised questions, it was the timing. Martin had been insistent on Michelle undergoing surgery, despite her initial reluctance. He had personally handled her medication, controlling every dose. He had been the only one in the house with her when she died. And the moment she was gone, he had moved quickly, pushing for a fast burial, bringing Gypsy Willis into their home, and attempting to erase Michelle's presence from their lives as if she had never existed. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. Investigators gathered witness statements from Michelle's friends, many of whom recalled her speaking about her fears in the weeks leading up to her surgery. They collected financial records showing Martin's attempts to redirect Michelle's assets into his control. They pieced together a pattern of deception, betrayal, and, most damning of all, premeditation. And then came the final, inescapable realization. Michelle McNeil hadn't died by accident. She had been murdered. It was the turning point Alexis had been waiting for. Martin McNeil may have spent his life outrunning the truth, but now it was catching up to him, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. The verdict had been delivered, guilty. The words echoed in the courtroom, carrying the weight of years of deceit, manipulation, and silent suffering. Martin McNeil had controlled the narrative for so long, convincing the world he was a brilliant doctor, a devoted husband, a respectable man. But now, stripped of his power, his titles, and his carefully crafted lies, he was nothing more than a murderer in shackles. As he was led away, his expression remained cold, unreadable. There was no remorse, no acknowledgement of what he had done. He had spent his life controlling others, but this was beyond his reach. Justice had caught up to him, and there was nothing left for him to manipulate. For Alexis, the victory felt hollow. She had spent years fighting for this moment, unraveling the lies, piecing together the truth, refusing to let her mother's death be dismissed as an accident. She had pushed forward even when others told her to move on, And now that it was over, she felt the exhaustion seep into her bones. Her mother was still gone. The house Michelle had so lovingly cared for would never feel the same. Her laughter would never echo through the halls again, her warmth never filling the rooms. No amount of justice could bring her back. But there was something else, a truth more powerful than grief. Michelle's voice had not been silenced. She had known something was wrong. She had felt the danger creeping into her life. And though she hadn't lived to see the battle unfold, her words, her warnings, had led to the truth. It was because of her strength, her instincts, that Martin had not gotten away with it. And it was because of Alexis's unwavering love for her mother that the truth had been heard. The lessons of Michelle McNeil's story extended far beyond the walls of that courtroom. It was a reminder that monsters do not always come in the form of strangers. They can be husbands, fathers, doctors, men who wear masks so convincingly that the world fails to see the darkness beneath. It was a testament to the power of perseverance. Had Alexis given up, had she allowed doubt to win, Michelle's death would have remained an unsolved tragedy. But truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of clawing its way to the surface. And it was a warning to everyone who has ever felt uneasy in their own lives, in their own relationships, to trust their instincts. As Alexis stepped outside the courthouse, the crisp air filled her lungs, cold but invigorating. She looked up at the sky, the weight on her chest still there, but lighter than before. She had done what her mother asked of her. She had been strong, she had fought, and because of that, Michelle McNeil's story would never be forgotten. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.